today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to take a look at the premier book of the Old Testament for prophecy, the book of Daniel. And chapter 2 is the most important chapter of the entire history of the human race, outside of perhaps the fall in the Garden of Eden, Calvary, and the second coming of Christ in Revelation 19. This is a pivotal chapter, an epic chapter in world history. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me Deciphering Daniel.
And what a story it is. You know, JR, you really can't overstate Daniel chapter 2 in terms of its historic and prophetic importance, because it defines the times of the Gentiles in a way that no other chapter in the whole Bible does. As a matter of fact, it speaks of the great battle between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, and it puts this in the context of Gentile world empires during the dispersions of God's chosen people throughout the world.
It begins with a dream by King Nebuchadnezzar, a dream which he forgot. He could not remember the next morning what the dream was about. The dream was so important that Nebuchadnezzar asked for the soothsayers and the magicians and astrologers throughout his kingdom to come before him and tell him the dream and the interpretation. Well, there was only one little problem with that. Nobody knew what the dream was. And this dream is so definitive that it makes for the most important chapter in all of prophetic studies. So don't miss what we're about to share with you. Gary, you talked about this idea of the big picture of God versus the devil, and the seed of the woman versus the seed of the serpent. It is apparent, it is clear in this chapter as we look at the fall of Israel and the rise of the times of the Gentiles. Let's look at chapter 2.
Let's look at chapter 2, and there's a fascinating aspect to chapter 2, because verse 1 is Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Verse 2, he commands all of his astrologers and so forth to come together to interpret the dream. Verse 3 says, well now, I really want to know this dream. Verse 4 says, then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac. O king, live forever, tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. JR, the fascinating thing is that this fourth verse shifts linguistically to another language, the Aramaic, called here Syriac. And the scholarship of today, that is 20th century scholarship, says that because this is written in Aramaic, Daniel is probably a much, much later book. And therefore, the things written here as prophecies really aren't prophecies at all, that, well, they are a fabrication by some later author. That's simply not the case.
The pointy heads of today don't get the point.
True.
The brilliant minds of theology today miss it completely. This is most important, that Daniel is giving to us the times of the Gentiles. And the verse that launches these next few chapters that give us the history of Gentile domination over Jerusalem are literally written in a Gentile language. From this fourth verse of chapter 2 to the last verse of chapter 7, and of course in chapter 7, we see the conclusion of the matter with the rise of the little horn, referred to in other places in the Bible as the Antichrist, and the coming of Jesus Christ to destroy the wicked and to establish a kingdom and turn it over to his saints. It's all there, and the concluding verses of chapter 7 give us the conclusion of the times of the Gentiles with the second coming of Christ and the establishment of the kingdom of heaven on earth. And it's written in a Gentile language.
As a matter of fact, it's written in what's called the Royal Aramaic. And the Chaldeans are speaking to the king. They say, King, live forever. Tell us the dream. We'll give you the interpretation. As a matter of fact, they can't. And the idea here of the Chaldeans, JR, this is a term that's roughly synonymous with Babylonians, although what it really refers to is their spiritual position. Chaldeans are supposed to be extremely learned, extremely wise, the wisest men of that day, and they can't tell the dream.
As a matter of fact, these Chaldeans were of the original idolatry. They worshiped the devil, and they had contact, evidently, with demonic spirits. And we know right up at the front that they were unable to tell Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was about. They did not have privy. The demons that possessed these astrologers did not have privy to God's dream that he gave the king. I think that's interesting.
That's right, and they're unable to answer. Now we have here developing a kind of a conflict at court, because these guys could get their heads chopped off if they were not able to give the king what he wanted. And so the search went out for someone who could tell the dream, and that's where Daniel and the three of his Hebrew brethren come into the picture, starting in about verse 14.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar says, "Oh, you don't know the dream? I don't know the dream. You can't tell me the dream? If you can't, then you're false. If you don't know the dream, then you're not in contact with the higher powers that you claim to be in contact with." In fact, I guess, Gary, they were in contact with the lower powers.
Definitely.
And so we have this fury of the king and his decree to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. But in verse 14, Daniel answered the council with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said, "Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree so hasty from the king?" Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. Then Daniel went in and desired the king that he would give him time, and he would show him the king the interpretation. And it all boils down to this: Daniel was in contact with the higher power, not the lower power.
And you know, that's illustrated in the names. When Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were abducted and taken to Babylon, their names are very interesting. Daniel means God is my judge. Daniel, God is my judge. Hananiah means the Lord has been gracious. Mishael means who is like God. And Azariah means the Lord has helped. In other words, all their names gave tribute to God. Their names were changed to Belteshazzar, the one who protects Bel. That's what they called Daniel. And the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were all the names of Babylonian gods, but yet when they pray to the God of Israel, we see an amazing thing here. The sevenfold attributes of God, beginning in verse 21, where, actually verse 20, where Daniel and his three brethren pray for God's guidance. This is a keynote passage.
And tell us about these seven attributes.
Well, we have, starting in verse 20, Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his," number one. "And he changeth the times and the seasons," number two. "He removeth kings and setteth up kings," number three. Number four, "he giveth wisdom to the wise." Number five, "he giveth knowledge to them that know understanding." Number six, "he revealeth the deep and secret things." And number seven, "he knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him." These are the seven attributes of the one true God, worshipped by Daniel and his brethren.
And they simply asked the Lord to tell them the dream. And Daniel has the dream given to him in a night vision, verse 19. And so he goes before the king, and he reveals to the king the dream, and then the interpretation of the dream. And this dream is of a monster man with a head of gold, with arms and a chest of silver, with a midsection of brass, legs of iron, feet of iron and clay, with 10 toes. This represents the times of the Gentiles. Most important that we understand this. Gary, there's some aspects about this monster man
Indeed.
that shows the weakness of Gentile domination.
Now, we are going to have to break in a moment, but before we do, this statue that Jared's calling the monster man, This statue is designed to illustrate the times of the Gentiles. And JR, the best thing we can say about this statue is that it's designed to fail. Anytime you build a statue like this, it's gonna fall down. It has the heavy part at the top, and it has feet of clay. It is absolutely destined to fall over.
Yes. There's no strength to hold iron and brass and silver and gold in the clay feet. And we'll show you that when we come back in just a moment. But first understand that these represent the Gentile nations, Babylon, Meado-Persia, Greece, and Rome. As Daniel told King Nebuchadnezzar his dream, his memory came back. He remembered, yes, that's it. That's the dream that I dreamed. And obviously, Daniel became important in the eyes of the king. In fact, he was later given the position of sitting in the gate of Babylon. That is a very high advisor to the king, because the king recognized that he, aside from the astrologers and the soothsayers and the other wise men of Babylon, Daniel alone had access to the one who put the dream in the mind of Nebuchadnezzar. Now he gives the interpretation of this dream, head of gold in this monster man. That represents Babylon. The arms of silver, the Medes and the Persians. The midsection of brass, the empire of Greece under Alexander the Great, and then his 4 generals, followed by the legs of iron, Rome. Now, in the days of the 1st and 2nd century, Gary, Rome was still a single empire.
Yes.
But over the centuries, Rome split between the East and the West. The Byzantine Empire, from what is today called Istanbul, is the capital, then called Constantinople, and then the Western Empire under the authority of Rome, and the Holy Roman Empire that eventually ruled Europe. It was called a Holy Roman Empire beginning in 1262. So we have this fragmented empire. That's why we have the 2 legs, I think, representing the East and the West of the Roman Empire. And then, of course, that is to be followed by democracy, the clay.
The clay.
And the iron and the 10 toes. And this is most important. We'll have more to say about that. But Gary, let's look at these metals and note that the metals may be more expensive. The gold is more expensive than the others, but it is not as strong. Iron, being the least expensive, is the strongest of the metals. So we see a weakness and a strength contrasted there.
Yeah, a play on different types of strength, because what we have is decreasing value. The top of the statue is gold with a specific gravity of 19.5, the most precious. The next metal is silver, has a lower specific gravity of 10.7. Brass, the next one, has a specific gravity of 8.0. Then iron, 5.0. And finally, miry clay, that is brittle or breakable clay, 1.9 on the scale. So we have decreasing value. We have increasing strength for a while until you get to the toes, and then suddenly it all falls apart. And then you have decreasing economics. At the top, gold. And we all know that anything backed by gold is a better economy. Then silver, and then brass. Of course, that's the kind of coins we carry in our pocket today, JR.
Yes.
and then we have iron, and then clay. Decreasing economic value. Prophetically, this speaks of the fate of the men of the latter days who weep and howl because their gold has become cankered. And so, JR, we have the Gentile world empires represented here as descending in economic value, increasing in strength for a time, and then at the last, they fall apart. Mm-hmm. And the agent that does the final breaking is a stone cut out without hands.
Now, let's look for a moment at this times of the Gentiles. It occurs when God's holy nation, Israel, is scattered and sent into exile. And this exile was to last in Babylon for 70 years. But Gary, beyond that, Israel was to be at the mercy of the Meado-Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, to be scattered again to the nations, to these four major powers of the world, down through history. And only in this day has Israel been regathered in their homeland, because we have come to the feet of clay. You've heard it, you've heard the cliche, when a man has feet of clay, that means that he is a sinful man, that he his downfall is of his own making.
Well, and this statue could be said to represent the evil effects of sin upon mankind, in which sin finally causes a complete rotting and breakage. You know, Gibbons said, no one conquered the Roman Empire, it just fell apart.
Yes.
And you know, it fell apart. It'll rise again one day as a global institution, and then it will be smashed by this stone that was cut out without hands, Daniel 2:34, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. J.R., now we come to the elementary aspects of this fourth kingdom, represented by part iron and part clay and by 10 toes, because there's a fascinating addendum here. Verse 42 says, and as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry, that is brittle clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of man, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. Who are these mysterious they?
Well, Gary, I was going to ask you that question. If they mingle with the seed of men, it means simply that they are not the seed of men. Now, I think we're talking about demonic entities here. The seed of the serpent from the Garden of Eden, the serpent who beguiled Eve, has been around. I want you to know that this is a spiritual entity called the devil, whose name is Lucifer. Satan, some call him. He is the main enemy of God, and he is the one behind the Gentile world powers. You remember when the angel fights with the prince of Persia? Right. Same thing we're talking about here.
Yes. A
spiritual warfare going on in heaven between God and the devil, and it's played out through these times of the Gentile nations.
J.R., it starts in Genesis 3:15, where the Lord God is speaking to Satan. He says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Of course, this is a prophecy of the Messiah, the stone cut out without hands, and his virgin birth, the seed of the woman. But J.R., it's also talking about the seed of the serpent. And the serpent is constantly trying to mingle his evil seed with that of mankind to corrupt man genetically. Genesis chapter 6 tells us all about that in the days of Noah, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. And Jesus in Matthew 24 reiterated that, saying, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. In other words, this whole thing, this mingling of the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, or humanity, will continue in the last days.
Mm-hmm. Now, you know, there are a lot of people who are saying, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. There's no such thing as a real demonic force. Well, I want you to know there is a real devil, and there are demonic forces. They are real people. They have minds. They think. They try to seduce mankind. All we have to do is look around us today to see the influence of Lucifer and his program against the human race. Without him, mankind would be a lot better off, wouldn't they, Gary?
Absolutely. Now, this is a prophecy of the future and of the decline and fall, shall we say, of the Roman Empire, yet future. Josephus himself said about this event, Daniel did also declare the meaning of the stone to the king. And then he went on to describe the fact that Daniel is speaking here of what he called futurity. And whether they will happen or not, let him be diligent in the reading of the book of Daniel, which he will find among the sacred writings. Josephus believed that it was a book of the future, and he didn't want to go into detail. It wouldn't have been healthy for him to do so in the days of the Roman kings.
Certainly, since he was in the household of the Caesar himself.
Yes.
But you see, in the end times, there are going to be 10 toes. These toes represent 10 nations for a world government. And we see them in the 10 horns of the beasts in Revelation 13. And we'll be looking at them as we get to Daniel chapter 7 and explaining it fully in our study. But just understand now that there will be a very short time, I think depicted by the short toes,
yes,
on this monster man, when the Antichrist will rule over this world for a few years, but Jesus will come, destroy him, and set up the kingdom of heaven. We'll be back in just a moment.